Okay, I'm sorry I didn't bring you anything to color this week. So I'm sure you all had a lot of fun with that last week. That's all right. I wasn't going to grade them. I was just joking. So, but yeah, I mean, last time, just as a recap, we discussed how the Promised Land was carved up into the territories which were allotted to each of the tribes of Israel, with the exception of the Levites, of course, who inherited cities within each territory, wherein they would perform their priestly duties. So we discussed the era of the judges and the rise of the kings of Israel, the unified kingdom and its expansion under both David and Solomon. And we talked about eventually how the kingdom of Israel was divided into the northern and southern kingdoms, the north consisting of the 10 tribes known as the kingdom of Israel, and the southern part of Judah as the kingdom of Judah. And eventually, the kingdom of Israel would fall to the Babylonians. Sorry, I'm going to get into a little bit of history here because there's a lot of, we're talking about a period of time in between testaments. So in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's not really anything written. So I went and did the research for you, folks. So we're going to get you up to speed on what happens in those 400 years between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So eventually the kingdom of Israel would fall to the Babylonians, who carried away the northern 10 tribes into captivity, leaving Judah in ruins and the city of Jerusalem destroyed. Babylon would eventually fall to the Persian Empire, which is modern-day Iran, and a king named Cyrus the Great would grant his cupbearer, an Israelite named Nehemiah, governance over the province of Judea and allow him to rebuild the city of Jerusalem and start remigrating the captive Israelites back to the land of Israel. Now this would begin this intertestamental period of the Bible, which consists of about 400 years of undocumented history between the book of Malachi and the gospel accounts of the New Testament. Now, undocumented, I mean in the Bible. Obviously, it's been documented by historians and others. So, intertestamental means literally between the testaments. So, between the Old Testament and the New Testament. All right. So, just because there are no biblical writings covering this time period does not mean that it was devoid of events on the world stage. It's during this period of time that we see the rise of Alexander the Great, whose empire encompasses all of the land of Israel. And as we know from other historians in the era, his empire would be divided between his 4 generals upon his death. Now, it's during this time that Antiochus Epiphanes is established as king over the province of Israel. Now, he desecrates the temple that Nehemiah rebuilt by erecting a statue of Jupiter Olympus in there, which is kind of like the Greek version of Zeus. Now, this forced Hellenization, and Hellenization is just a term that was used to mean kind of like the conforming of peoples to the Greek culture. Helen of Greece, I don't know, they named it after her. So Hellenistic means Greek. If you hear that word, it just means that it's kind of like the westernization, if you will. How we westernize everywhere we go. I'm sure Iran will probably be full of Family Dollars soon, because that's what we do. We move into an area and we put up Family Dollars and Dollar Generals. So Hellenization was kind of like that. Everywhere the Greeks went, they erected their own temples. They put up statues of their own gods. They kind of forced people to use their money systems, their language, which is why most of the New Testament is written in Greek, because that was at the time kind of the status quo language. Even though Rome was occupying Israel during that period of time, the Romans still utilized Greek because Rome and Greece were pretty close to each other and they understood each other's languages. So even though the Romans spoke in Latin, Greek was kind of the common language, if you will, at the time. All right, so the forced Hellenization of Israel results in what's called the Maccabean Revolt. I'm not going to get into a lot of details about this, but a family of Jews heads up this rebellion. Mattathias is kind of the leader of this rebellion, and his fighters retake the temple in 164 BC. This results in, or the resulting battle, and what happens with that is what they now celebrate as Hanukkah. And I'm not going to go over all of what Hanukkah is, but this happens during this intertestamental period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So that's why Jews today still celebrate Hanukkah, and a lot of Christians don't because it's not really referred to in the Bible. And we tend to be looking at the Bible for our source of what are we supposed to be doing here. And since there's nothing written about Hanukkah, a lot of Christians don't really do Hanukkah. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with Hanukkah. It's not a religious festival in that sense. It's celebrating the miracle that God worked for the Jews during that period of time in which they were retaking the temple. All right, so the Maccabees would eventually gain political independence, and they established the Hasmonean dynasty. This would be a short-lived dynasty, though. It was around 60 BC, the Roman general Pompey conquers Jerusalem, which is held for roughly 20 years, when it's then again invaded by the Parthians. Now, the Parthians kind of came from over here, Parthian. So the Parthians kind of were over in sort of the same areas as the Persians, but in a different part of what is now modern-day Iran. So they were another force that kind of just came out of the west or out of the east and occupied that space. So while we had the Romans came in, took over, and then the Parthians came over and kind of kicked the Romans out, and they set up their own king on the throne in Israel, a guy by the name of Antigonus. So Antigonus chases off Herod, who is at that point the Judean king, and Herod takes off for Rome to get help from Julius Caesar. He comes back, he retakes Jerusalem, kills Antigonus, and he reestablishes himself as king of the Jews. And this brings us right up to the beginning of the New Testament. We got Herod on the throne. Rome is back in control of the Promised Land. So, it's in the wake of many years of unrest, with Israel being ruled over by the Greek Hellenists, the Parthians, then Rome. We come to the beginning of our story of the birth of Jesus Christ, to a young couple in the Galilean province of Palestine, which has been named thus by the Romans after the age-old enemy of the Jews, the Philistines. Now, they did this kind of as a stick in the eye to the Jews because the Jews kept causing them so many problems. And so they decided, well, we're just going to name it the province of Palestine after the enemies of the Jews, just to get them, upset. So, where are we? All right, so he is born in a town called, I know it's all mixed up here. All right, Jesus Christ, to a young couple in the Galilean province of Palestine in a town called Nazareth, right here. There lived a man of the tribe of Judah whose lineage can be traced back to King David. Joseph was a carpenter by trade who was engaged to a young woman named Mary. Now Mary found favor in the eyes of the Lord, and he chooses her to bear his son, who is to be named Jesus. At this time, there was a census being taken throughout the land, or so we're told by Luke in his gospel account. And Joseph, being of the house of David, returns with his very pregnant wife, Mary, to Bethlehem of Judea, which is down here. Now, remember, there were two Bethlehems. I don't know if it shows the other Bethlehem up here. But there was a Bethlehem up here, and there was a Bethlehem in Judea. But we're told specifically by the prophet Micah in Micah 5 and verse 2, "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." So this was done so that it would fulfill this prophecy in Micah. So it was that while Joseph and Mary are in Bethlehem, Mary gives birth to Jesus Christ. Now the harmony of the Gospels gets a little weird here because we're told that when the wise men from the east see the star and they come to find Jesus, born King of the Jews, that they come to a house where Jesus and Mary and Joseph are living. But it's definitely still in Bethlehem because they first stop in Jerusalem and have an audience with Herod, who secretly wants to find this king and kill him because he doesn't want his lineage to be threatened by some outsider. Now it says that, they left Jerusalem and they went to Bethlehem. So they left Jerusalem here and went to Bethlehem. The wise men did when they were coming to see Jesus. But it says like they came to a house, so no longer in a manger, and we don't know whose house it was. Possibly a relative of Joseph. If his family was originally from there, it's possible that there was some relative that took them in for a period of time, or it could just be that they were renting out a room there after some of the people had already left because of this census. That we know that there was no room in the inn for them, so now maybe they got a room in the inn. I don't know. But it says that they came to the house where Jesus and Mary and Joseph were. And they give him the gifts, and then they leave by a different route, not telling Herod about where they found Jesus. Now, we're also told that after Mary's purification period, so after she had given birth, she goes through a period of purification, Jesus is taken to the temple in Jerusalem to be dedicated. And it's there that Joseph is told to leave by an angel, because Herod is seeking to kill Jesus. So they didn't return home. I know that a lot of people kind of have this picture that when the wise men came, that Jesus was somehow older, but it doesn't really fit with the harmony of the Gospels in that way, because had they gone back to Nazareth, they would have had to have come all the way back to Jerusalem to dedicate him. And it says that it was after her period of purification. So they wouldn't have gone anywhere during that time. So after she had given birth, they've left from Bethlehem and went up to Jerusalem, dedicated him at the temple, and it was there that he was told to leave for Egypt. Well, if he left for Egypt, then the wise men wouldn't know where to find him, right? So it's really, if you read the gospel accounts and you try and look at how they all kind of fit together, there's a lot of pieces that are kind of missing, but we piece it together as best as we can, and that's sort of the picture that I've gotten, at least from reading the gospel accounts, is this is kind of how it went down. And then they leave from Jerusalem and they go down into Egypt to flee from Herod, because he puts out a decree to kill all of the boys from Bethlehem aged 2 and younger, because he didn't know how old Jesus was. So he just said 2 years old and younger, kill all the male children. And that also fulfills another prophecy in Hosea 11 and verse 1, which was written, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." So he was called back out of Egypt, and that fulfills that prophecy. So once Herod passes away, Joseph's told again by an angel that it's safe to return to Israel. He makes the trek back to Nazareth, all the way up here, which is his hometown, with Mary and young Jesus. And it's here that Jesus would spend the quiet years of the gospel accounts. We're told very little about Jesus' childhood up until the age of 12, where we get this little story about him being left behind in Jerusalem while they're visiting for the feast. And then he's found in the temple by his parents after several days of looking for him, and he tells them, "Hey, didn't you know I had to be about my father's business?" So that's a fun one. But in those years of his childhood, he would have spent much of his time in and around Nazareth and Cana, which is right up here. Now on a map, it doesn't look like much. I mean, who could tell me what this area is actually geographically like by looking at this map? Nobody. Well, it's kind of green and it's got some shading in there, so I don't, we don't really get that picture. So what I'm going to kind of go through today, I've got a great book that goes over kind of the geography of the Bible and of Israel in particular, and it breaks down everything about these regions and what it would have been like for Jesus at that time. So I kind of compiled all of that into this lesson, and we're just going to kind of get a little bit more of an in-depth look of what it would have been like there. Was he in the middle of the desert? Was it hot all the time? Was it cold? So we're going to answer some of those questions, and maybe it'll help us kind of give a better picture in our minds when we're reading these stories about Jesus. What's going on there? What would it have looked like? All right. Okay. So we're looking at the region of Judea called Galilee, which is this green area here that's been circled for us. Galilee, right there. The name Galilee comes from a Hebrew term that sort of means like on the edge. So it's kind of like on the edge of a circle. And if you look at Israel, it kind of fits that description because it's really kind of up here on the edge, the northern edge of Israel, and it's sort of on the outskirts. So that's where the name Galilee comes from. So Galilee is the most complicated area of the land of ancient Israel. This is most obvious in its geological structure and surface topography. Here, down-faulted basins cut across uplifted ranges on acute angles, and natural routes are forced to find their way through tight mountain passes, around swamps or canyons, and over rushing streams. The southern half of Galilee is part of the Galilee-Bashan Basin, down in here. The Galilee-Bashan Depression, a broad geological trough that runs completely across the southern Levant on an east-west line. So it kind of runs this way across here. It's sort of like a valley, if you will. The depression severs the spiny backbone that forms the hill country core of the southern Levant, in effect separating the hills of Judah and Ephraim and Manasseh from the higher mountains of Galilee. So there's kind of mountain range that sort of runs this way, and the mountain range that runs this way, and then there's this flat kind of depression in between the two. As a result, Galilee as a whole is geographically more connected to Phoenicia, which is up here, and Lebanon than it is to the rest of Israel, because it's kind of separated by this valley, if you will. While Phoenicia is characterized by seaports and the heartland of Israel is dominated by land routes, Galilee, by geographical nature, has ample access to both. This makes the southern sections of Galilee, namely the Jezreel Valley, Akko Plain, and to some extent the lower Galilee, an important corridor for international traffic flowing between the desert routes of the Transjordan. And where is the Transjordan? Does anybody remember? Trans means across, and Jordan is the Jordan River. So the Transjordan means pretty much anything on this side of the Jordan River. So this area over here, it provided kind of a route for people to come from this area out to the sea, to the Mediterranean Sea. All right, the southern parts of the Galilee are a true land between, busy in their own right, but critically positioned to be controlled by either Israel to the south, Phoenicia to the northwest, Iran, Damascus to the northeast, or more likely in the end by one of the cat empires lying just beyond Israel's frontier. Overall, Galilee contains the most fertile regions in the land of Israel. Abundant rain falls throughout, and numerous alluvial plains foster strong economies where communities can thrive. In the 1st century AD, Josephus summarized the character of Galilee nicely, though as a native of the region, he must be excused for his obvious exaggeration of his homeland pride. He wrote, "The land everywhere is so rich in soil and pasturage and produces such variety of trees that even the most indolent are tempted by these facilities to devote themselves to agriculture. In fact, every inch of the soil has been cultivated by the inhabitants. There's not a parcel of wasted land. The towns, too, are thickly distributed, and even the villages, thanks to the fertility of the soil, are all so densely populated that the smallest of them contains more than 15,000 inhabitants." So we're talking about a very populous area, but it's also spread out by farmland, and the farmland is very rich and fertile. The Jezreel Valley is the largest and most fertile of all the valleys in the land of ancient Israel. It is also the only one that provides a flat, straight line connection between the coastal plain and the Transjordan. Though the valley is known by several different names in ancient sources, it is the name Jezreel Valley that is most common in the Old Testament. The name certainly derives from the valley's association with the city of Jezreel, a place at a prominent juncture on the valley's eastern side that became Israel's secondary capital in the 9th century BC, during the reigns of the expansionist kings Omri and Ahab. The Jezreel Valley is approximately 20 miles long on each of its angled sides and 17 miles across its widened eastern end. The Trod shaft runs another 10 miles southeastward southeastward to Beth Shean and the Jordan River. So it's kind of wider in this area, and then there's like a little kind of more of what they call the Hayrod Shaft, which runs down here to the Jordan River. The Jezreel's southeastern bay slumped between the hills of Manasseh and the hook of Mount Gilboa, which is right over here, is lower, topping out at only 230 feet above sea level. This part of the Jezreel Valley is especially given over to swampy conditions, as the water that drains the western face of Gilboa backs up behind the valley's basalt sill. Near Tanakh, on its southern edge, were the waters of Megiddo, which was the staging ground for Sisera's force of 900 chariots that became trapped in a morass of mud and mire when in a thunderstorm. Ahab's deluge-dodging chariot dash from Mount Carmel to his capital at Jezreel. The Mount Carmel, if you remember, is right kind of in that area there. That also crossed over the same ground. Now, there's an interesting anecdote here. Gertrude Bell, an eccentric British adventurer, traveler, and self-styled diplomat during the years prior to the First World War, tried to cross the Jezreel Valley from Haifa to Jenin on February 1st, 1905, over approximately the same line that Ahab raced his chariot from Mount Carmel to the city of Jezreel 27 centuries before. She was somewhat less successful than the king. She writes, "I had a ride full of vicissitudes from Haifa. The first day was extremely and unavoidably long, 31 miles, which is more than one can comfortably take one's animals. However, the road lay all across the plain of Jezreel, and the mud was incredible. We waded, sometimes for an hour at a time, knee-deep in clinging mud. The mules fell down, the donkeys almost disappeared. You could see nothing but his ears. And the horses grew wearier and wearier. I got into camp after dark at a place called Jenin, feeling very tired and headachy and wondering why I did this." So, the entire floor of the Jezreel Valley, as well as its arid extension, is covered with dark, rich alluvial soils that sometimes reach up to 330 feet deep. These soils hold water very well, too well in fact, but usually dry out nicely during the hot months of summer. Jezreel means God sows. It's a perfect name for the place that no doubt prompted the psalmist's sobriquet, the pasture lands of God. Jesus once opened a parable with the words, "A rich man's land was very productive." If you remember this one. He then continued, "He thought to himself, what should I do since I don't have anywhere to store my crops? I will do this," he said. "I will tear down my barns and build bigger barns and store all my grain and goods there." The setting for this story could have been many places in Galilee, but the reputation of the Jezreel Valley in particular, fertile, yet vulnerable and usually in the hands of a strong outsider, lends a special punch to Jesus' tagline when he says, "You fool, this night your life is demanded of you." For all its strategic value is being front and center, the Jezreel Valley was primarily a place not within, but between the established regional power centers of the day. Israel to the south, Phoenicia to the northwest, and Syria to the northeast. From high atop the Nazareth Ridge, so although this is a depression area and kind of a valley here, there's ridges on either side. The northern ridge was called the Nazareth Ridge, and that's where Nazareth is. From high atop the Nazareth Ridge, the mount where he grew up and became strong, filled with wisdom, and God's grace was upon him, Jesus' view into the Jezreel Valley took in the broad sweep of Israel's already ancient history, from the victories of Deborah, Barak, and Gideon to the crushing defeat of Saul and then Josiah, as well as the lone prophetic voices of Elijah and Elisha, who went about towns and villages doing good. Jesus was able to confirm God's ongoing redemptive activity by an eyewitness view into the arena of his own people's past. With it, the center of so much divine human effort in the land of ancient Israel brought together not just north and south, but past and present, God and man. Now, so he, on this ridge up here, would have had just a sweeping view of this valley that's just this fertile valley that's, like you said, full of history, of ancient history at this point of Israel. Now, in the 1st century AD, the houses of the unpretentious village of Nazareth clustered around a small spring. With fertile, though chalky soil, relatively soft natural building material, a water supply that was adequate but not particularly plentiful, and a bottom of the bowl, though on top of the ridge horizon line, the inhabitants of Nazareth were never going to get rich on the resources at hand. The economic basis in the better connected Jezreel and Beth Natopa valleys, which is north of it, Beth Natopa valleys downslope were far superior. By comparison, residents of towns and cities in these advantaged valleys, such as, if you remember him, Nathanael, one of Jesus' disciples, who was from Cana, understandably fostered the backwater stigma and would say things like, can anything good come out of Nazareth? So they kind of held their noses up at people of Nazareth because there's not really a lot going on there. It wasn't an economic center. There wasn't really a lot of rich folk there. There wasn't a lot of trade. He kind of was out of the way of everything. And so being in Cana, which was down in the valley more, they were surrounded by farmland and richer, they kind of had a little bit of a snobbish attitude towards Nazareth. All right. Yeah, this is where Jesus would have spent most of his boyhood years, working alongside his father Joseph up until the age of 30, when he goes down to the Jordan to visit his cousin John, who baptizes him in the river. And then he goes off into the Judean wilderness from there, over in here somewhere, where he is tempted by the devil for 40 days. Upon the completion of his time of tempting, we're told that he travels down to the coastal town of Capernaum. Okay, we finally get a different area to look at. So Capernaum is right here on the northern edge of the Sea of Galilee, where he begins teaching. Now, most of Jesus' ministry would occur around the perimeter of the Sea of Galilee, with several trips being made to Jerusalem and southern Israel. Now, the Sea of Galilee is the only sizable natural body of fresh water on the Mediterranean's eastern seaboard. How many of you knew it was a freshwater sea? See, when I always hear the word sea, I think salt, right? And especially because it drains into what? The saltiest sea on the planet. This is the saltiest lake there is. So I just assume naturally, it's got to be salt water as well. But no, it's a freshwater lake. It's a lake. Let me be clear about this. The Sea of Galilee is a lake. It is not a sea. Now, the reason that it's called the Sea of Galilee is because in Hebrew, they didn't have a word for lake. Even if you notice, reading through the Old Testament, it talks about the temple or the tabernacle. They had what they called the bronze sea, which was basically a giant wash basin for the priests that they would wash themselves in. There was no term other than a large body of water, so they just called it a sea. So lakes were called seas. Now, when it was translated into Greek, there is a Greek word for lake. They chose not to use it. They chose to use the word sea. Now, I don't know if that was just a throwback to their own heritage, that they like that better or what, but now we call it the Sea of Galilee, but it is just basically a giant freshwater lake. Just like our Great Lakes, only our Great Lakes are way bigger. All right. Okay, so even though it's the only large natural body of freshwater on the Mediterranean's eastern seaboard, it played only a minor role in the recorded history of the Old Testament. So Jesus chose Capernaum, a bustling village on the sea's northern shore, as his adoptive home. The Sea of Galilee covers 64 square miles in surface area. It's up to 150 feet deep in the north, but noticeably shallower at its southern end, where a muddy islet sometimes appears offshore. Hills rising as much as 1,300 feet from the surface of the water surround the Sea of Galilee on nearly every side, giving people living at water's edge a bit of a hemmed-in, protected feel. In some places, the hills come quite close to the shore, leaving scarcely a level place by which to pass. The Sea of Galilee creates winds of its own. During the late hours of the night, weak winds often blow from the shore toward the center of the sea. As the land-water temperature ratios moderate early in the morning, the direction of the winds is reversed. This rhythm is disrupted most afternoons when strong Mediterranean winds sweep into the sea's basin from the west. Their force is bolstered by a wind tunnel effect caused by air funneling through the east-west valleys of western Lower Galilee. And we just read about that valley that kind of comes right through there. When these strong westerly winds drop over the Poria Ridge, they scoop along the sea's basin before finding their way up and over the eastern side, or the eastern rise of the Lower Golan, which is on the opposite side here. The effect is particularly strong in the winter and during the spring and fall transitional seasons when the weather can change with little warning. Now, local fishermen report that the highest waves that they have experienced reach 6 feet high, creating walls of water plenty high enough to swamp the low-slung fishing boats of the 1st century AD. And then we read that story. In fact, it's one of Liam's favorite. Almost every night when they tuck him into bed, he's like, "Tell me the story about Jesus on the boat." And I have to ask which one, because there's a couple of them, but on pretty much all of them, Jesus calms the waters of the sea by speaking to him and saying, "Peace, be still." So apparently the waves were strong enough to at least, cause them to be worried that they might flip over. All right. So the traditional site of the Sermon on the Mount, is a rise on the Rosh pinnacle sill above Capernaum. So just above Capernaum here, kind of on this rise above the lake, or the sea there. While proof of the spot remains elusive, all reasonable evidence suggests the bulk of Jesus' Galilee teachings were given somewhere in that vicinity, within the triangle enclosed by Capernaum, Bethsaida, and Chorazin. So this is Bethsaida here, here's Capernaum, and there's Chorazin. So kind of in this triangle here is where he does a lot of his teaching and a lot of his speaking to the crowds. From here, it's possible to see the Hellenized Decapolis city of Hippos. In Jesus' day, and I don't know if we put Hippos on the map here. Oh, there it is, right there. So from there, they would have had a good view of Hippos, which was up on the edge of the Sea of, the surrounding area of the Sea of Galilee. From there, it's possible to see the Hellenized Decapolis city of Hippos. In Jesus' day, the largest city around the lake. That was set high on a hill. Jesus and his disciples must have seen its lights almost every evening, beckoning the call of a Rome away from Rome. "It is you who are the light of the world," Jesus told his disciples. In effect, a city situated on a hill cannot be hidden. In the same way, you too should let your light shine before others, so they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Now, Byzantine memory identified the city on a hill as Jerusalem, even though Jerusalem is hidden among the hills rather than prominently visible on one. Geographical common sense suggests instead that because Jesus referred to an unhidden city on a hill while he was in Galilee to a Galilean audience, that we should look there rather than to Jerusalem for his on-the-ground reference. So it's more than likely that the city on a hill that he was talking about, or probably while he was sitting there with his disciples, pointed out across, the lake as the sun was going down. They see the lights of Hippos coming on. He pointed to that and said, a city on a hill cannot be hidden, which is a pretty obvious thing. All right. So, speaking of Jerusalem, where were we? Yes, speaking of Jerusalem, where Jesus would spend the final week of his ministry before his death on the cross, Jerusalem boasts no natural features that would normally define or sustain a major place of settlement. It has no harbor, no river, not even a decent view. There's no major trunk route running through it, no on-hand supply of natural resources for production or export, and it barely has enough water to supply its own daily needs. Jerusalem was, in the astute assessment of George Adam Smith, on the road to nowhere. Other than its own historic associations, and these in the end have overridden all else, Jerusalem is indeed cramped by its tight geographical setting and is relatively cut off from the larger flow of events moving along the international highways of the Levant. Looking eastward, the city is isolated not only by the drop of the Judean wilderness, down in here, but by the, where did I lose my place? Drop of the Judean wilderness, but by the ridge of the Mount of Olives, which at 2,661 feet is 224 feet higher than the hill on which the temple was built, and it completely blocks the view to the east. To the west, beyond the watershed, Jerusalem sits behind the deepest part of the ragged Sorek Wadi system. So Jerusalem at the time of Jesus' ministry was home to the second temple, which was rebuilt by Nehemiah and then renovated by Herod when he came into power. However, approximately 30 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, that temple would yet again be destroyed by Nero, fulfilling Jesus' prophecy that not one stone would be left upon the other. In fact, all that would remain of the temple would be the western wall of the Temple Mount, which is a holy and sacred site for Jews today. Now, if you've seen the pictures of them, they all go to what they call the Wailing Wall, which is just that western wall. That's all that remains of the second temple. And there they will bow. You'll see them making their, as they pray, the way that they pray, every time they say the name of God, they're supposed to bow. But they have kind of like prescripted prayers that they go through. And so as they go through them, they're going through them so fast, they forget like where they're at. And so they just constantly do this because they don't want to miss bowing when they say the name of God. So I don't know, it's an area where they'll put their prayers into the cracks in the rock and everything. That is the Western Wall that still exists today. Okay. All right, so that's a sacred site for Jews today, and they've tenuously allowed the Palestinians to maintain the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Dome of the Rock as the third most holy site of Islam. So if you see that golden dome when you're looking at Jerusalem, that is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It is a Islamic mosque that was put there, and understandably, because Jerusalem is like the third most holy site in Islam, they don't just go in there and like destroy it, because that would cause a lot of upset in the region, because they're surrounded by Muslims in the Middle East. So it's been there, and they've kind of had this relationship with the Palestinians within Israel that they continue to allow them to worship at the mosque there, even though that is their Temple Mount, where the temple was at one point, and the temple was destroyed, and they built this mosque on top of where the temple was. However, time's coming, according to prophecy, when the third temple will be built. And it may be in our own lifetimes. Events in the Middle East and the world at large are shaping up. One of the requirements for the temple to be rebuilt was the sacrifice of a perfect red heifer. The ashes of that sacrifice are used in the purification ceremony for purifying the Levitical priests before rebuilding the temple. Last year, there was a sacrifice of a red heifer that Israel claims was just a trial run, but it could very well be used for that purpose. Geopolitically, the timing was not quite right for them to storm the Temple Mount and destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque and start rebuilding the third temple. However, now with the seat of Islamic power in the Middle East under siege by Israel and the United States, the timing feels more right now than ever for Israel to step in with an alliance backed by the United States as the major world power and establish the building of a third temple. This would set into effect an eschatological, who here knows what the term eschatology means? It's a study of the end times. Anytime you hear somebody talk about eschatological events, they're talking about end time events in the Bible. So it would start a end time clock of about 7 years leading up to the return of Jesus Christ, who will return and stand on the Mount of Olives to the east of Jerusalem, and the mount shall cleave in two. And it's been discovered recently that there is actually a east-west fault line that lies directly underneath the Mount of Olives. So when he does, it could very well just split from that force. Muslim invaders during the Crusades walled up the eastern gate through which it was said that the Messiah would return and enter into Jerusalem to dispel any ideations of their Jewish subjects from attempting a coup. But when the mount splits in two, it could very easily cause that walled up gate to open up as well, allowing Jesus Christ to walk right in through that eastern gate, fulfill that prophecy. One other location that deserves some mention is Mount Hermon. Now this is where the Transfiguration took place. And it's northeast of the Hule Basin and Lake Hule, which is this tiny little spot on your map right here, and it probably doesn't have a name in most of your maps on your Bible. This is the Hule Depression right here. It's kind of the headwaters, if you will, of the Jordan River that feeds into the Sea of Galilee, that eventually feeds down into the Dead Sea. Now this water comes mostly out of Dan and Laish, which is this area right up here, but also off of Mount Hermon, which is a snow-capped mountain for most of the year, and it melts in the summertime, and that runoff melt from the mountain comes down into this valley, fills up this lake, and there's actually a really spectacular double waterfall up in this region here, and it's a very, very rich, dense vegetative area because of all the water that's in that kind of basin that fills that lake there. Now, Mount Hermon at 9,232 feet boasts a snowcap during the cold months of the year, which melt and feed the Hula Basin and Upper Jordan River. It's upon this snow-capped mountain that Jesus, John, James, and Peter meet with Moses and Elijah as Jesus is transfigured before their eyes. At this height, even in the summer months, the air would be quite cold. So it's no wonder the disciples brought tents and asked if Jesus wanted them to build a tabernacle for Elijah and Moses as well. So that kind of makes sense now looking back at it. I always thought, why do they build a tabernacle? Because a tabernacle is a temporary dwelling, right? So it's like a tent that you would stay in. And they don't really talk about, a lot of the times when it talks about Jesus and his disciples traveling around, they're not talking about building tents or tabernacles, wherever they go, mostly because the region that they were walking around in was pretty warm, and that wouldn't have been necessary. So it's just an interesting, extra mention in the Bible, and it makes you go, oh, okay, well, that makes sense now, because they were 9,000 feet up on a mountain. Up there it's going to be a little bit cooler. And obviously I don't think they made it all the way up the mountain and back down in one day. They were probably up there overnight, at least a couple of, I don't know how many nights they were up there. So, Mount Hermon's also canonically recognized in the book of Enoch as the place where the watchers came down from heaven to take wives for themselves from among the sons of men, identifying it kind of as a portal between heaven and earth, which is likely why Jesus ascended to its heights to commune with the spirits of Elijah and Moses, who would have at that time been in paradise or the bosom of Abraham, which is the place of rest for the righteous dead. Now, next week, we'll follow the expansion of the first century church, and we'll get dragged all over the Mediterranean with Paul, whose travels rival probably any character in the Bible, even those of Abraham. As we know, he traveled 3,000 miles or so. Paul puts him to shame. When you start to see the area that Paul traveled, it's truly remarkable, and it wasn't once, but 3 times he traveled this circuit. So bring your hiking boots, and we will follow around the apostles as they plant churches all over Asia Minor.